When I was 11, my family moved to a tiny village nestled in the shadow of a sprawling mountain range. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you blinked, a scattering of old stone houses connected by dirt paths and surrounded by dense woods. My mom had inherited the house from her great aunt, and with my dad's job in the city falling apart, we didn't have much choice but to pack up and start over. The house was ancient, with creaking floorboards and windows that never seemed to shut properly. My room was on the second floor, overlooking a backyard that stretched into a thicket of pine trees. Beyond the trees was a steep hill, and perched at its peak was a small, decrepit tower. It looked like something out of an old fairy tale, with vines crawling up its crumbling walls and a jagged hole where the roof had caved in. I asked my mom about it once, but she just shrugged and said it had been there as long as anyone in the village could remember. I wasn't thrilled about the move. I'd always been a quiet kid, more interested in books and drawing than making friends, and the thought of starting over in a place where I didn't know anyone felt daunting. But the first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time exploring the woods behind the house or sketching in my room, trying to make the best of things. Then one afternoon, I found the box. I'd been poking around in the attic, hoping to find something interesting among the dusty trunks and cobwebbed shelves when I spotted it. The box was small and wooden, with strange symbols carved into its surface. It was heavier than it looked, and when I opened it, I found a stack of old, yellowed papers tied together with string. The top page had a single sentence scrawled across it in messy handwriting, "Do you want to play a game?" I remember laughing to myself, thinking it must have been some kid's idea of a joke. Maybe a great aunt or distant cousin had hidden it away years ago. Still, I was curious, so I untied the string and started flipping through the pages. Most of them were blank, but a few had more writing, little notes like, "Come to the tower," or "You're getting closer." I didn't think much of it at first. I figured someone in my family had left it behind, so I tucked it back in the box and brought it down to my room. That night, I wrote a response on one of the blank pages, "Who are you?" Then, on a whim, I left the note on my windowsill and went to bed. The next morning, the note was gone. In its place was a new one, written in the same messy handwriting, "I'm your new friend. Come find me." I stared at the note for a long time, my heart pounding. Part of me thought it was a prank. Maybe one of the village kids had seen me in the attic and decided to mess with me. But how would they have gotten into my room without me noticing? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few days, the notes kept coming. Each morning there'd be a new one waiting on the windowsill with messages like, "You're doing great. We're almost there." They all seemed to be urging me toward the tower. I didn't tell my parents. I wasn't sure they'd believe me, and a part of me was intrigued. Whoever or whatever was leaving the notes didn't feel threatening. It felt playful, almost friendly. Finally, one Saturday, I decided to go. I grabbed a flashlight, stuffed the latest note into my pocket, and headed out just before sunset. The climb up the hill was harder than I expected, with thick undergrowth and loose rocks that made the path slippery. By the time I reached the tower, my legs were burning, and the sky had turned a deep, dusky orange. The tower looked even more ominous up close. The doorway was just a dark, gaping hole, and the air inside smelled damp and stale. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, my flashlight casting long shadows across the stone walls. The floor was covered in debris, broken tiles, rotting wood, and what looked like the remains of old furniture. In the center of the room was a small wooden table. On it was another note. "You found me," it said. "Come upstairs." I glanced up and saw a narrow staircase winding along the wall. It looked unstable, with chunks of stone missing and patches of wood that sagged under their own weight. But the curiosity that had been building over the past week was too strong to ignore. I started climbing. The second floor was even darker than the first, with no windows and barely enough room to stand. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something move in the corner. I froze, my heart racing, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like feet dragging across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I took a step forward, and the floor creaked loudly beneath me. The sound came again, closer this time, and I felt a cold rush of air brush past my face. I swung the flashlight around wildly, but the beam only illuminated more empty space. And then I saw a figure standing in the doorway at the top of the stairs. It was tall and thin, with pale, almost translucent skin and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. Its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, and as it took a step toward me, I saw that its fingers were unnaturally long, almost claw-like. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was running down the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, slamming the window shut and throwing the box into the darkest corner of the attic. I never went back to the tower after that. The note stopped appearing, and for a while I convinced myself it had all been some elaborate prank or a vivid nightmare. But sometimes late at night I think about those glowing eyes and that horrible grin, and I wonder if it's still up there, waiting for someone else to find the box. I don't usually tell this story because honestly it still makes me uneasy, but maybe getting it off my chest will help me make sense of it. This happened years ago when I was about 17, living in a small industrial town that had seen better days. There wasn't much to do, so my friends and I spent our time exploring old factories and warehouses that had long since been abandoned. We didn't think much about the danger back then, it was all just fun and adrenaline. One evening, my friend Theo came to me with news about a new spot he'd found. It was an old textile mill on the outskirts of town, half hidden by overgrown trees and rusted fences. The building had been shut down decades ago after a fire, but Theo swore it was still mostly intact. He said there was even a basement full of strange old equipment. I wasn't sure if he was exaggerating, but his excitement was contagious, and soon, 4 of us were piling into Theo's beat-up car, me, Theo, Ellie, and Jordan. The mill was massive, its silhouette looming against the darkening sky. The windows were shattered, the brick walls scorched black in places. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but a section had been cut open, creating a gap just big enough for us to squeeze through. Theo led the way, flashlight in hand, while the rest of us followed close behind. Inside, the place was even creepier than I'd imagined. The main floor was a maze of rusted machinery, tangled wires, and collapsing beams. The floor creaked under our weight, and every sound echoed like a gunshot. I remember stepping over piles of ash and debris, my skin crawling as I imagined what might be hiding in the shadows. Ellie, always the boldest of us, joked about finding ghosts, but her laughter sounded forced. Theo led us to a staircase at the back of the building, hidden behind a stack of broken pallets. The steps groaned as we descended, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom was a heavy steel door, slightly ajar. Theo pushed it open, and we stepped into the basement. The space was huge, divided into several rooms by crumbling concrete walls. The first room was empty except for some old crates and a rusted metal table. The second room, however, was different. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and there was a single chair in the center of the room, facing an ancient television set. The screen was cracked, and the whole thing was coated in dust, but it felt deliberate, like someone had set it up to be that way. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Who would even come down here? I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. We moved into the third room, and that's when things got strange. There was a long wooden workbench along one wall, covered in tools that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber: hooks, clamps, saws. Most were rusted, but some gleamed like they had been recently cleaned. Above the bench was a corkboard pinned with yellowed papers, diagrams, and photographs. One photo in particular caught my attention. It was of a group of workers standing in front of the mill, all smiling at the camera. But their eyes seemed wrong, like they were looking at something just behind the lens. Ellie was the first to notice the smell. "Do you guys smell that?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. It was faint at first, but as we moved deeper into the room, it grew stronger, a sickly sweet stench, like rotting meat. I could feel my stomach turning, and then we heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere beyond the walls. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but when I looked at the others, I saw the fear in their eyes. Theo turned off his flashlight, plunging us into darkness. Shh, he hissed. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside the room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then, without warning, the door behind us slammed shut. Ellie screamed and Theo fumbled to turn his flashlight back on. The beam flickered to life, illuminating the doorway and the figure standing in it. It was tall, its face obscured by a hood or a mask, and its hands were wrong. Too long, too thin. It didn't move, just stood there, blocking our only exit. None of us dared to breathe. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Run, Theo shouted, breaking the spell. We bolted for the door, shoving past each other in our panic. I don't know how we made it back up the stairs without tripping over each other, but somehow we did. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car, gasping for air and trembling from head to toe. We didn't talk about what we'd seen, not that night, not ever. Theo tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a squatter trying to scare us, but I could tell he didn't believe it. None of us did. I never went back to the mill, and as far as I know, neither did anyone else. Years later, the building was demolished, and a shopping center was built in its place. Sometimes when I drive past it, I feel a strange sense of unease, like the ground remembers what happened there. I'll never forget that night, no matter how much I try. And to this day, I still wonder what was that figure, and why was it waiting for us? When I was 7, my parents had a knack for turning our modest farmhouse into the center of the neighborhood's Halloween festivities. It was their way of making up for our secluded life on the outskirts of town, far removed from other kids and excitement. Every October, they transformed our barn into a haunted maze, complete with eerie props, fake cobwebs, and dim, flickering lanterns. It wasn't just for fun, it doubled as a fundraiser. Guests would donate canned goods for admission, which my parents then delivered to the local food pantry. That particular Halloween was memorable for all the wrong reasons. As usual, my cousins Jack, Henry, Chris, and Will came to help set everything up. They loved scaring kids who ventured into the maze, hiding behind hay bales or creeping out of shadowy corners. This year they wore identical white masks with emotionless expressions eerily blank, like they'd been made to be unsettling. I didn't love the masks, but they were all about making things extra creepy. The event kicked off at dusk and people came in droves. Families from around town showed up with bags of canned goods, laughing and chatting as they waited their turn to enter. I ran around with a few friends, giddy with excitement, helping guide people through the maze while occasionally pretending to be scared myself. Everything seemed normal until a man showed up alone. He wasn't carrying any bags of food, which was strange, but he handed my dad a single can of soup and mumbled something about his wife and daughter coming later. My dad, ever the optimist, thanked him and let it slide. I remember catching a glimpse of the man as he walked away. He wore a faded brown coat, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets. Something about the way he moved stiff and deliberate made me uneasy. But I was a kid, and I quickly forgot about him as the night wore on. The maze was packed with kids and parents by the time my friend Sarah came running up to me, crying. Someone grabbed me, she said, clutching her wrist like it still hurt. I asked what she meant, and she pointed to one of the barn's darker corners. He was wearing one of those white masks, she said, her voice trembling. He tried to pull me into the storage closet. I froze. At first, I thought it had to be one of my cousins playing a prank, but Sarah's fear was real. She wasn't laughing or exaggerating. I grabbed my mom and told her what Sarah had said. My parents took it seriously right away. They called all my cousins out of the maze and asked if any of them had done something stupid. They all denied it, but then we realized one of them, Will, wasn't there. Just as panic started to set in, Will came running in from the house. He looked annoyed, holding his mask in his hand. "What's going on?" he asked. Apparently he'd gone to use the bathroom, leaving his mask on the kitchen counter. When he came back, it was gone. He thought one of the other guys had taken it to mess with him. That's when my dad shut everything down. He escorted everyone out of the barn and called the police. Officers showed up and searched the property thoroughly, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no suspicious tracks, just nothing. I went to bed that night feeling rattled but reassured by the police presence. I figured the worst was over, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was faint at first, like someone lightly knocking on my bedroom window. Our house was old with heavy wooden shutters, and I told myself it was just the wind. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to fall back asleep. The tapping stopped, but later I was woken again, this time by scratching. It was slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across the glass. My heart pounded as I debated what to do. I finally worked up the courage to peek out from under the covers, and before I could think better of it, I threw the curtains open. There, just inches from the glass, was a face. Or rather, a mask the same blank, white mask my cousins had worn earlier. The figure stood perfectly still, staring directly at me. I screamed louder than I ever thought possible. My parents burst into the room seconds later, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. The police came back and searched the yard, but once again they found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed grass, no signs that anyone had been there. A few months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. We didn't hold another haunted maze after that, and my parents went overboard with security new locks, motion lights, and even cameras. I still felt uneasy though, like the mask was lurking somewhere, just out of sight. Then, one day I came home from school to find a white mask lying on my bed. It was identical to the ones my cousins had worn, but this one had my name scrawled across the forehead in bold, black letters. I stared at it, paralyzed. My parents called the police again, but there was nothing they could do beyond filing another report. There were no signs of a break-in, no footage on the cameras, nothing to explain how it had gotten there. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But sometimes late at night, I still wake up to the sound of faint tapping on the window. I tell myself it's just a dream. At least I hope it is.